Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing no one could ever love you again. For 15 years, mountain man Ezra McLean has lived in the Colorado wilderness, nursing wounds that never healed after losing his wife and unborn child. His cabin sits miles from anywhere, exactly how he wants it. When a winter storm drives a homeless woman and her young daughter to his door, Ezra's first thought is to send them away. He's not built for kindness anymore. But one look at the child's scared face changes something in him. He offers them shelter for one night. Sarah and 8-year-old Emma carry their own secrets. They're running from something. As the blizzard rages outside, these three strangers discover that sometimes God puts the right people together at exactly the right moment. What happens when broken people find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a living thing against the log walls of Ezra McLean's cabin, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would bury the Colorado mountains under 3 feet of snow before dawn. He'd built this place with his own hands 16 winters ago, choosing a spot where the pine trees grew thick and the nearest neighbor lived a hard day's ride away. Every log had been cut and notched with the precision of a man who understood that solitude was earned through sweat and deliberate choice. Ezra sat in his worn leather chair beside the stone fireplace, turning the thin gold band on his ring finger as he had every night for 15 years. The metal had grown smooth under his thumb, worn thin by countless worried rotations. Margaret's ring, the only thing he'd kept when he buried everything else that mattered in a grave outside Atlanta, along with the child who would never draw breath. The knock came soft at first, barely audible above the storm's fury. Ezra's hand stilled on the ring. In 15 years, nobody had found this place in winter. Hell, most folks didn't even know it existed. The sound came again, more insistent now, followed by a woman's voice calling through the wind, "Please, if anyone's there." "My daughter, she's so cold." Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd learned long ago that opening doors led to heartache. Better to let the world pass by, better to tend his own fire and leave other folks to their troubles. But something in that voice, the desperate edge of a mother protecting her child, struck a chord he'd thought long dead. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 52, the mountain winters had settled into his bones like old friends who overstayed their welcome. Through the thick glass window beside his door, he could make out 2 shapes huddled on his porch, a woman wrapped in a thin shawl and a small figure pressed against her side. The woman looked up as his shadow crossed the window. Even through the frost-covered glass, Ezra could see her eyes, dark, exhausted, but holding a spark of fierce determination that reminded him of Margaret when she'd set her mind to something. The child beside her couldn't be more than 8 or 9, her small face blue with cold, against every instinct that had kept him alive and alone for 15 years. Ezra lifted the heavy wooden bar from across his door and pulled it open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his hands, driving snow across his threshold like nature's own invitation to reconsider. "One night," he said without preamble, his voice rusty from disuse. "Storm passes. You move on." The woman's relief was visible, even in the dim light spilling from his cabin. "Thank you. God bless you, thank you." She gathered the child closer and stepped across his threshold, bringing with them the scent of wood smoke, wet wool, and something else, the particular smell of people who'd been traveling hard roads for too long. Ezra barred the door behind them and turned to study his unexpected guests properly. The woman was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair escaping from a wool cap and clothes that had seen better seasons. But it was the way she carried herself that caught his attention, straight back despite exhaustion, with the bearing of someone accustomed to better circumstances. The child, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves, peered at him from behind her mother's skirts. Despite the cold and fear, There was curiosity in her gaze, the kind of fearless interest only children possessed. "I'm Sarah Patterson," the woman said, extending a work-worn hand. "This is my daughter, Emma." Ezra hesitated before taking her hand. Her grip was firm, honest, the handshake of someone who believed in meeting troubles head-on. "Ezra McLean, Mr. McLean, I can't tell you how grateful. Just Ezra," he cut her off, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get the child by the fire before she catches her death." Sarah guided Emma to the hearth, while Ezra studied them both. The girl's boots were worn through at the toes, her coat patched in several places but clean. Despite their obvious poverty, there was something about them that spoke of recent hardship rather than lifetime destitution. The woman's hands, while calloused from recent hard work, had the long fingers of someone who'd once held books more often than tools. "How long you been traveling?" Ezra asked, settling back into his chair while Sarah helped Emma out of her wet coat. 6 days from Denver," Sarah replied, wrapping the girl in her own shawl despite her own shivering. "We were trying to reach my sister in Leadville when the storm caught us." Ezra nodded but said nothing. In his experience, people on the run always had a destination that was just one more town away. He'd learned not to pry too deeply into stories that didn't quite add up, mostly because his own story had enough holes to drive a wagon through. Emma's teeth had stopped chattering, and color was returning to her cheeks. She looked around the cabin with the frank assessment of childhood, taking in the rough furniture Ezra had built himself. The shelves lined with books, more books than most mountain men possessed, and the few personal items that spoke of a life once lived in gentler circumstances. "Are you a soldier?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice clear and sweet despite her earlier distress. "Was," Ezra replied, surprised by the question. "Papa was a soldier too," she said, then glanced at her mother as if she'd spoken out of turn. Sarah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Emma, don't bother Mister. Don't bother Ezra with questions." But Ezra found himself curious about this small person who seemed unafraid of a strange man in an isolated cabin. "What makes you think I was a soldier?" Emma pointed to a daguerreotype on the mantel, one of the few personal items Ezra had kept. It showed a younger version of himself in a Union cavalry uniform, standing beside a beautiful woman in a white dress. "You stand like Papa did. Straight and ready." The observation was surprisingly astute for a child. Ezra glanced at Sarah, who was studying the photograph, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Just something to keep my hands busy," he said. Embarrassed by her interest, she turned the carved bear over in her small hands, examining it with the careful attention of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. "It's wonderful. Can you teach me?" "Emma," Sarah warned gently. But Ezra found himself almost smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. "Maybe, if your mother doesn't mind." Sarah looked between them, and Ezra saw something shift in her expression, a cautious hope that she was trying hard to suppress. "We'll be gone in the morning, as soon as the storm passes. Storm like this might last 2-3 days, Ezra said, and was surprised to find he didn't mind the prospect as much as he should have, as if summoned by his words. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow down the chimney to hiss against the fire. Emma moved instinctively closer to her mother, and Sarah's arm tightened around her daughter's shoulders. "Well then," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes, "I suppose we'll need to make the best of it." Ezra stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it, he pulled out 2 wool blankets, thick, warm ones he'd traded for years ago but never needed. "You can sleep by the fire," he said, offering them to Sarah. "I'll take the loft." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the blankets, and Ezra was startled by the warmth of her touch. It had been so long since he'd felt another person's skin against his own that he'd almost forgotten what human contact felt like. That was my wife. Margaret," he said, the words coming easier than they had in years. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "What happened to her?" The old pain rose in Ezra's chest, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a blade twisting in his heart. "Fever took her while I was off fighting. Her and our child." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, filled instead with the kind of shared understanding that came from mutual loss. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to rest on Emma's shoulder, a protective gesture that spoke of her own fears and losses. "I'm sorry," she said, and something in her voice told him she knew exactly what that kind of loss felt like. Emma had moved closer to the fire, drawn by the warmth and the collection of wood shavings scattered on the hearth. "Did you make these?" she asked, picking up one of the small wooden animals Ezra carved in the long winter evenings. "Thank you," she said again, but this time her gratitude didn't make him uncomfortable. This time it felt like something he might actually deserve. As the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ezra prepared to spend his first night in 15 years sharing his sanctuary with other people. He told himself it was just one night, that come morning he'd send them on their way and return to the solitude that had become his religion. But as he climbed the ladder to his loft and looked down at Sarah settling Emma by the fire, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought died with Margaret and their unborn child. It was dangerous, this feeling. Hope had a way of making a man careless, and careless men lost everything that mattered. Still, as he lay on his narrow bed, listening to the soft murmur of Sarah's voice as she told Emma a bedtime story, Ezra found himself touching the ring on his finger, not with the familiar ache of loss, but with something that felt almost like peace. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside the cabin, 3 strangers had found shelter from more than just the cold. They'd found, perhaps, the beginning of something none of them had been looking for, but all of them desperately needed. The possibility that broken people could still create something whole. Dawn came grey and muted, filtered through clouds heavy with unspent snow. The storm had gentled during the night, but the wind still whispered promises of worse weather to come. Ezra woke to the unfamiliar sounds of other people stirring in his cabin, the soft rustle of blankets, quiet voices, the particular silence that comes with guests trying not to wake their host. He lay still for a moment, listening. 15 years of solitude had made him acutely sensitive to any change in his environment, and this morning his cabin felt transformed. The air carried the scent of Sarah's hair, the warmth of bodies that had slept by his fire. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. "Mama, is he awake?" Emma's whisper carried clearly to the loft. "Hush, sweetheart. Let the man rest. He's been kind enough to shelter us." Ezra smiled despite himself. The child had no concept of quiet, even when she thought she was being whisper-soft. He climbed down from the loft to find Sarah folding the blankets with military precision, while Emma sat cross-legged by the dying fire, examining one of his carved animals with intense concentration. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Sarah looked up, and he was struck again by the intelligence in her dark eyes. She'd braided her hair back from her face, revealing the fine bones of someone who'd once been well cared for. "Good morning. I hope we didn't wake you." "Sun woke me." Ezra moved to the window and peered out at the white world beyond. The snow had drifted against his door, and more flakes fell steadily from the heavy sky. "Storm's not done with us yet." He watched Sarah's face carefully as he delivered this news. Some people might panic at the prospect of extended isolation, but she simply nodded, accepting the reality without complaint. "Well then," she said, echoing her words from the night before. "I suppose we make the best of it." Emma bounced to her feet, apparently delighted by the prospect of staying longer. "Can you show me how you made this?" She held up the wooden bear, her small fingers tracing the careful details Ezra had carved into its fur. "Emma." "Oh, don't impose," Sarah said quickly, but Ezra found himself nodding toward his workbench in the corner. "I suppose there's no harm in it." What followed was perhaps the most pleasant morning Ezra could remember in years. He showed Emma how to hold a knife properly, how to work with the grain of the wood, how to let the shape emerge naturally from the block. Her small hands were clumsy at first, but she had patience, a rare quality in a child, and genuine enthusiasm for the work. Sarah busied herself around the cabin, tidying with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making order from chaos. She didn't ask permission to sweep his floors or organize his shelves. She simply did what needed doing with the natural authority of a woman comfortable in domestic spaces. "You don't have to," Ezra began. "I know," she said simply. "But we're here, and this is how I can contribute." By midday, Emma had managed to rough out the basic shape of a small bird from a piece of pine. Her face glowed with pride as she showed her mother, and Sarah's delight in her daughters. Accomplishment was so genuine that it made Ezra's chest tighten with memories of dreams he'd buried long ago. It was while they were eating a simple lunch of beans and cornbread that Emma suddenly went quiet, pressing her hand to her forehead. "I don't feel good, Mama," she said, her voice small and uncertain. Sarah was at her side immediately, placing a practiced hand against her daughter's forehead. The color drained from her face. "She's burning up." Ezra moved closer, and even from arm's length he could feel the heat radiating from the child's skin. Emma's eyes had taken on the glassy sheen of fever, and she swayed slightly where she sat. "Get her to the bed," Ezra said, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. He'd seen enough fever in his time. On battlefields, in army camps, in the long nights when Margaret had slipped away from him, degree by degree. He knew how quickly a child could go from sick to dying. Sarah lifted Emma with the careful strength of a mother accustomed to carrying her child. "What can I do? Tell me what to do." The desperation in her voice cut through Ezra like a blade. This was what he'd tried to avoid. The moment when other people's pain became his responsibility, when their loss threatened to tear open his own carefully healed wounds. But looking at Emma's flushed face and Sarah's frightened eyes, he found himself moving with the decisive purpose he'd once brought to cavalry charges and criminal pursuits. "Cold water," he said, pulling blankets from his chest. "We need to bring her temperature down. There's willow bark in my supplies. I'll make tea." They worked together through the afternoon as the storm intensified outside. Sarah bathed Emma's face and arms with cool water while Ezra brewed medicinal tea from his carefully maintained stores. The child drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her father, sometimes asking for water in a voice that broke both adults' hearts. "She's never been this sick," Sarah whispered during one of Emma's quieter moments. "Not even when—" She stopped herself, but Ezra caught the slip. "When what?" he asked gently. Sarah's hands stilled on the cloth she was using to cool Emma's forehead. "When we were living rough, before we found the boarding house in Denver. Even then, sleeping in barns and begging for food, she never got truly ill." "How long were you living rough?" 3 months. Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Ever since Marcus, ever since we had to leave Kansas." Ezra filed the name away, but didn't press. People running from something always had a Marcus or a Samuel or a Judge in their story. What mattered now was the child burning with fever in his bed. As evening approached, Emma's condition worsened. She became delirious, calling out for her father, crying for her doll, a toy she apparently didn't have with her. Sarah's composure finally cracked, and she began to weep silently as she tended her daughter. "I can't lose her," she whispered. "She's all I have left. She's all that's good in this world." Something in Sarah's words, the raw honesty of a mother facing her worst fear, broke through the walls Ezra had built around his heart. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own. "We won't lose her," he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I won't let that happen." Sarah looked at him through her tears, and he saw something shift in her expression, a fragile trust that he realized he would die before betraying. Working through the night, they took turns cooling Emma's fever and forcing small sips of willowbark tea between her lips. Ezra found himself telling stories from his childhood to the delirious girl, his voice low and soothing as he described the farm where he'd grown up, the horses he'd trained, the simple pleasures of a life he'd almost forgotten he'd once lived. Near dawn, Emma's fever finally broke. She opened clear eyes and asked for water in a voice that, while weak, was blessedly lucid. Sarah collapsed into Ezra's arms, sobbing with relief, and he held her while she shook with the aftermath of terror and exhaustion. It was in that moment with Sarah's tears dampening his shirt and Emma safe in his bed, that Ezra realized his life had fundamentally changed. The careful isolation he'd maintained for 15 years had been breached not by force, but by need, by the simple human requirement to care for others and be cared for in return. As Emma slept peacefully for the first time in 18 hours, Ezra moved to his workbench and began carving. His hands worked almost automatically, guided by an impulse he didn't fully understand. By the time Emma woke again, he had finished a small wooden doll, crude but recognizable as a girl in a long dress, with carefully carved features that could have been anyone's daughter. "Anyone's hope made manifest, for you," he said simply, pressing it into Emma's small hands. The smile that lit up her pale face was worth 15 years of loneliness. And when Sarah looked at him with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of love, Ezra knew there was no going back to the man he'd been. Before they knocked on his door, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, 3 people had found something warmer than any fire. They'd found each other. 3 days after Emma's fever broke, the storm finally exhausted itself against the Colorado peaks. Ezra woke to the kind of crystalline silence that only followed heavy snowfall, a hush so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Sunlight streamed through his windows, turning the cabin golden and revealing a world transformed by winter's artistry. Emma had recovered with the remarkable resilience of childhood. Though she still tired easily and stayed close to the warmth of the fire, she clutched the wooden doll Ezra had carved for her, which she'd named Grace, with the fierce possessiveness of a child who'd learned not to take comfort for. "Granted, the trail will be impassable for weeks," Ezra said over breakfast, stating what all 3 of them already knew. He'd scouted as far as the tree line the previous evening and found snow drifted higher than a horse's withers in the low places. Sarah nodded, her spoon stirring absently at her cornmeal mush. "I understand if you need us to leave. We could try to make it to—" "Where?" Ezra interrupted gently. "Where exactly would you go with a child who's barely recovered from fever, through snow that would come up to your waist?" The question hung between them, practical and unanswerable. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly as she faced the reality of their situation. They were trapped together, for better or worse, until spring decided to show mercy to the high country. "Besides," Emma piped up, apparently unconcerned by adult anxieties, "I haven't finished learning to carve yet." Despite everything, Ezra found himself smiling. The child had an uncanny ability to cut through complicated situations with the simple logic of someone who hadn't yet learned that life was supposed to be difficult. As the days settled into routine, Ezra discovered that sharing his space wasn't the burden he'd expected it to be. Sarah moved through his cabin with quiet efficiency, transforming it from a bachelor's rough shelter into something that felt remarkably like a home. She hung her few spare clothes on pegs beside his, set wildflowers she'd somehow coaxed from the snow in empty bottles on his shelves, and filled the spaces between with the particular warmth that came from being cared for by someone who paid attention to details. Emma brought different gifts, the sound of laughter echoing off log walls that had known only silence, the simple joy of teaching someone who wanted to learn. She absorbed Ezra's lessons about mountain survival with the intensity of a scholar, asking endless questions about tracking, weather signs, and the habits of the creatures that shared their wilderness home. "Why do the deer come down from the high country before a storm?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by the fire, both of them working on their carving projects. "Same reason you come inside when you're cold," Ezra replied, guiding her small hands as she worked the knife around a particularly difficult curve. "They're looking for shelter, food, warmer places to wait it out. Are we like the deer, then? Coming down from the high country?" The question was more perceptive than she probably realized. Ezra glanced across the cabin at Sarah, who was mending one of his shirts with careful stitches that would make it stronger than it had been new. "Maybe we are." In the evenings, after the day's work was done and supper cleared away, they'd found themselves drawn into conversation by the fire. Sarah proved to be educated far beyond what her circumstances suggested. She could discuss books Ezra hadn't thought about in years, spoke knowledgeably about politics and philosophy, and had opinions about everything from the proper way to preserve vegetables to the likelihood that electric lights would ever make it to places like their mountain. "You were a teacher," Ezra said one night, not really making it a question, Sarah's hands stilled on the sock she was darning. "How did you know?" "The way you explain things to Emma, the way you organize information, the books you mention reading." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "The way you correct my grammar when you think I won't notice." She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. It's been 15 years since I talked to anyone with more education than a trading post clerk. I'd forgotten there were people who cared about such things." "Education matters," Sarah said quietly. "It's the one thing no one can take away from you, no matter how bad things get." There was something in her voice, a bitter edge that spoke of experience, that made Ezra want to know more about what had brought her to his door. But he'd learned patience in his years of solitude, and he sensed that Sarah's story would emerge when she was ready to tell it. What he discovered instead, as the days passed, were the smaller revelations that came from living closely with other people. Sarah sang while she worked, old hymns and folk songs that filled the cabin with melodies Ezra had forgotten he missed. She was left-handed, but had clearly been forced to write with her right, which explained the careful concentration she brought to the simplest tasks. She worried about Emma in the particular way of mothers, who'd already lost more than they could afford to lose, and she was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with her features, though those were fine enough, and everything to do with the strength she carried with such quiet grace. Ezra found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way she moved, the expressions that crossed her face when she thought no one was paying attention. It was dangerous. This growing awareness of Sarah as a woman rather than simply a person who needed his help. Ezra had buried his heart so deep he'd thought it was beyond resurrection. But Sarah's presence was like water on dormant seeds, bringing to life feelings he'd thought were safely dead. Late at night, lying in his loft and listening to her quiet breathing below, he found himself pulling out a leather-bound journal he hadn't written in for years. By candlelight, he began recording his thoughts, tentatively at first, then with growing honesty about what these unexpected guests were doing to his carefully ordered world. February 15th, 1887. Emma asked me today why I live alone. Told her some people are meant for solitude, but even as I said it, I wondered if I was lying. How long has it been since I laughed? Since I looked forward to morning? Since I felt like there was purpose in rising from my bed? February 18th. Sarah's hands are healing from whatever hard work she's been doing. Watching her teach Emma to read with such patience and love, it makes me remember things I thought I'd forgotten. Makes me wonder what kind of father I might have been if things had been different. February 22nd. Caught myself humming one of Sarah's songs today while splitting wood. When was the last time I made a sound just for the joy of it? This woman is changing me in ways I don't understand and probably shouldn't allow. The journal became his confessional, the place where he could admit truths too dangerous to speak aloud. As February melted into March and the first signs of spring began to show in sheltered valleys, Ezra found himself hoping the snow would last just a little longer. That winter would hold its grip on the mountains and keep his unlikely family safe in the sanctuary he'd built, for one but learned to share with. 3. He was beginning to understand that some storms were worth weathering, and some shelters were only complete when they protected more than just yourself. By the first week of March, Emma had recovered enough to venture outside the cabin for short periods. Ezra watched from the doorway as she and Sarah built a snowman in the small clearing beside his woodshed, their laughter carrying on the thin mountain air like music he'd forgotten existed. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift slate from a smooth piece of stone, and most afternoons found her patiently teaching Emma letters and numbers by the fire, the sight of them bent together over their lessons, Emma's tongue poking out in concentration as she traced letters with her finger. filled Ezra with a contentment so profound it frightened him. "Why don't you have any children's books?" Emma asked one evening, as Sarah helped her sound out words from one of Ezra's volumes of Shakespeare. The question was innocent enough, but it landed like a physical blow. Ezra's hand moved unconsciously to the ring on his finger, and he saw Sarah's sharp glance in his direction. "Never had cause for them," he said quietly. Emma, with the directness of childhood, pressed on. "But you like children. You're teaching me to carve, and you made grace for me. And you tell the best stories about when you were little." "Emma," Sarah warned gently, recognizing dangerous ground. But Ezra found himself answering, drawn by the child's honest curiosity and perhaps by his own need to finally speak truths he'd kept buried for too long. "I was going to have a child once," he said, his voice steady despite the pain the words brought. "Your age, maybe a little younger. But sometimes life doesn't give you what you plan for." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Is that why you live alone? Because you're sad about your little one?" "Emma." Sarah's voice was sharp now, but Ezra held up a hand to stop her apology. "It's all right." He looked at the child's earnest face and found himself wanting to give her an honest answer. "Yes, partly. When you lose someone that important, it changes you. Makes you afraid to care about people again, because caring hurts when they go away. But we're not going away," Emma said with the absolute certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned that promises were fragile things. "We're staying here with you." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications none of them were quite ready to address directly. Sarah's face flushed, and she began gathering up their makeshift writing materials with unnecessary vigor. "We can't stay forever." "Sweetheart," she said to Emma, though her eyes remained fixed on her hands. "Ezra has his own life, and we have our own path to follow." "But where will we go?" Emma asked with devastating logic. "You said Leadville was too far, and Denver wasn't safe, and we don't have any money for train tickets." Sarah's movement stilled, and Ezra saw the weight of their situation settle across her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was trapped between her desperate need for safety and her fierce independence, between gratitude for his help and fear of becoming a burden he couldn't refuse. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her wooden doll, Ezra and Sarah found themselves sitting by the dying fire in the kind of charged silence that demanded honesty. "Tell me about Kansas," Ezra said quietly. "Tell me about Marcus." Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband James died in a mill accident 2 years ago, crushed by machinery that should have been replaced years before." Her hands twisted in her lap. "James had a brother, Marcus, older, meaner. Always thought James was weak for marrying a schoolteacher instead of someone who could work the land." Ezra waited, sensing there was more, and that pushing would only make her retreat. "After James died, Marcus decided Emma and I were his responsibility. His property." The last word came out bitter as wormwood. "He had debts, you see. Gambling debts to dangerous men. Thought he could marry me off to pay them, use Emma as leverage to make sure I cooperated." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Ezra felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest, the same controlled fury he'd once brought to hunting men who preyed on the innocent. "When I refused, he got mean about it. Started coming around the little house James left us, making threats. Said Emma would be better off without a mother who didn't know her place." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "The night he came with 2 other men, talking about taking Emma to teach me sense. We ran. Took what we could carry and ran." "How long has he been hunting you?" 6 months. Sarah looked up at him then, and he saw the exhaustion of someone who'd been running too long. "We made it as far as Denver, found a boarding house that would let Emma and me work for our keep. I thought maybe we were safe, that he'd given up, but he hadn't. No, someone recognized us, sent word back to Kansas. We barely got out ahead of him." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold together pieces that wanted to fall apart. "I don't know what to do anymore. Ezra, I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of Emma having to live like a fugitive for crimes she never committed. Ezra stared into the fire, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities the way it once had when he'd worn a badge and hunted men for a living. Marcus sounded like every other bully he'd ever encountered, dangerous but ultimately predictable. The kind of man who relied on fear because he lacked the courage for direct confrontation. "He won't look for you here," Ezra said finally. "Not in winter, not this far into the mountains. Spring, maybe, but not now. And what happens in spring?" Sarah's question held all the fear she'd been trying to keep hidden from Emma. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, understanding that his answer would change everything between them, would either offer hope or force her to start running again with nowhere left to go. "In spring," he said slowly, "we figure out how to make sure he can't hurt you anymore." The use of "we" wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah's breath caught, and she looked at him with something that might have been hope struggling to be born. "You don't know what you're offering," she whispered. "Marcus isn't just one man with a grudge. He has friends, people who owe him favors. Getting between him and what he wants, it could be dangerous for you too." Ezra smiled then, an expression that held more steel than warmth. "Lady, I've been dangerous longer than your Marcus has been alive. The question isn't whether I can handle him. The question is whether you're ready to stop running." Sarah studied his face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her straighten her shoulders and lift her chin with the first real hope she'd shown since arriving at his door. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's walls and reminding them that winter still held the mountains in its grip. But inside, two adults had just made the kind of decision that changes everything. While a child slept peacefully nearby, trusting in the protection of people who were learning, perhaps, that some things were worth fighting for. The morning after Sarah's confession found Ezra standing in front of a wooden chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. His hands rested on the iron latches, and he could hear Sarah moving quietly around the cabin behind him. Emma's sleepy voice asking questions about breakfast and whether the snow foxes they'd glimpsed yesterday would come back. Normal sounds. Domestic sounds. The kind of sounds that made a man remember what he had to lose. Ezra lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay the tools of a trade he'd thought he'd abandoned forever. His father's Sharps rifle, the one that had put food on their table when Ezra was Emma's age. A Colt revolver he'd carried through 3 years of war and 10 years of marshalling. Boxes of ammunition, still dry and functional. Maps of Colorado territory marked with hideouts and safe houses from his law enforcement days, and at the bottom, tarnished but still serviceable, the 5-pointed star that had once given him the authority to hunt men like Marcus Patterson across half the Western Territories. That's quite an arsenal. Ezra turned to find Sarah standing behind him, Emma thankfully occupied with her carving at the table. Sarah's eyes moved over the weapons with the assessment of someone who understood their significance. "Tools of the trade," Ezra said quietly, lifting the rifle from its resting place. The weight of it was familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. "What trade was that exactly?" Ezra met her gaze directly. "I was a federal marshal for 10 years after the war, before I came to the mountains." He watched the information settle in her expression, saw her reassessing everything she thought she knew about the quiet mountain man who'd offered them shelter. A federal marshal was a far different thing from a simple hermit. It meant authority, connections, the kind of skills that could make Marcus Patterson's life very complicated. "Why did you stop?" she asked. The question was inevitable, and Ezra had been dreading it since he'd decided to open the chest. "Because the last man I hunted got away by threatening Margaret. Made it clear he knew where she lived, what she looked like when I'd be away on duty." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I chose her safety over the job. Turned in my badge, sold everything we owned, came up here where no one could find us. But she died anyway." "Yeah." The word came out harsher than he'd intended. "Fever took her the winter after we arrived." Irony being that if I'd stayed a marshal, stayed in civilization, she might have had access to a real doctor. Sarah was quiet for a moment. absorbing the full tragedy of his choice, how trying to protect his wife had led to the very isolation that made saving her impossible. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "but I'm also grateful that you know how to fight men like Marcus." Ezra began checking the rifle's mechanisms with the automatic competence of someone who'd performed the ritual thousands of times. Knowing how to fight them and being willing to are different things. "I came up here to get away from violence, Sarah, from hunting and being hunted. But you'll do it anyway." It wasn't a question. Ezra looked across the cabin at Emma, who was humming softly as she worked on her carving, completely unaware of the adult conversation taking place 10 feet away. The sight of her, safe, content, trusting, made the decision easier than it should have been. "Yeah," he said, "I'll do it anyway." Over the following days, Ezra began preparations that felt like putting on an old coat that still fit perfectly despite years in the closet. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, studied his maps, and began the careful process of reaching out to contacts he'd thought were lost to time. The nearest neighbor capable of helping was Tom Mackenzie, a former cavalry sergeant who ran a small ranch 15 miles down the mountain. Ezra made the trip on snowshoes, carrying a carefully worded letter that would tell Tom everything he needed to know without putting anything too specific on paper. Tom was older now, grayer, but his handshake was still firm, and his eyes still held the alertness of a man who'd seen too much trouble to be complacent about peace. "Ezra McLean," Tom said, grinning at the sight of his old friend. "Thought you turned into a complete hermit by now." "Close enough," Ezra replied. "But I need a favor, Tom. A big one." He explained the situation in broad strokes. A woman and child being hunted by dangerous men. The likelihood that come spring, those men would extend their search into the high country. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the implications became clear. "You know I'll help however I can," Tom said when Ezra finished. "But if this Marcus character is as connected as you think, it might take more than just the two of us to handle him proper. I was hoping you'd still have contacts with some of the other veterans in the area. Men who might remember what it was like to fight for something that mattered." Tom's smile was grim, but determined. "I'll put out some quiet words. There's maybe 6 or 7 men within a day's ride who served with distinction and aren't too old to handle themselves in a fight. Good men who don't like bullies. They spent the afternoon working out details, communication methods, supply caches, fallback positions. It felt like planning a military campaign, which in many ways it was. By the time Ezra started back up the mountain, both men understood that spring would bring more than just melting snow to the high country. Back at the cabin, Ezra found Sarah teaching Emma to read from a book of poetry. Both of them curled together by the fire like they'd been doing it all their lives. The scene was so perfectly domestic that it stopped him in the doorway, rifle still in his hands. Caught between the world of violence he was preparing for and the world of peace he was trying to protect. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, looking up from the book. "Good. We'll have help when we need it." Emma looked up from the page she'd been sounding out. "Help with what?" Sarah and Ezra exchanged glances over her head. They'd agreed to keep their preparations as invisible as possible, not wanting to frighten the child with concerns she couldn't do anything about. "Just mountain things, sweetheart," Sarah said smoothly. "Making sure we're ready for spring." Emma nodded and returned to her reading, satisfied with the explanation. But Ezra caught the look Sarah gave him, grateful but also fearful, understanding now that the sanctuary they'd built was temporary, and that maintaining it would require the kind of violence she'd spent months trying to escape. That night, as he wrote in his journal by candlelight, Ezra found himself grappling with the contradiction of his situation. March 8th. Took up arms again today for the first time in 15 years. Felt familiar and strange at the same time, like putting on clothes that belonged to a different man. But watching Sarah and Emma by the fire tonight, seeing the peace in their faces, I know why I'm doing this. Some things are worth fighting for, even if fighting changes you. The hardest part isn't preparing for violence. It's knowing that once I cross this line, I can never go back to being just Ezra the Hermit. Sarah and Emma will have seen me as something else, a protector maybe, but also a killer. Will they still feel safe with me after they've seen what I'm capable of? He closed the journal and looked down at the cabin's main room, where Sarah slept peacefully on her makeshift bed by the fire. Tomorrow he would continue his preparations, would take more steps down a path that led away from the peaceful isolation he'd cultivated for 15 years. But tonight, listening to the quiet breathing of the people who'd become his family, whether he'd planned for it or not, Ezra found he had no regrets about the choice he was making. The first sign of trouble came not from the valley below, but from Emma's dreams. She began waking in the night, calling out for her father, tears streaming down her face as she fought phantoms only she could see. "He's coming?" "Mama," she whispered one night as Sarah held her close by the dying fire. "The bad man. He's coming to take us away." Sarah's eyes met Ezra's across the cabin, and he saw his own concern reflected in her face. Children often sensed danger before adults acknowledged it, picking up on tensions and undercurrents that grown-ups tried to hide. "It's just a dream, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, smoothing Emma's hair. "We're safe here with Ezra." But Emma shook her head with the stubborn certainty of childhood. "No, Mama, he's really coming. I can feel it." Ezra had learned to trust instincts, both his own and others, and Emma's distress felt like more than simple nightmares. The next morning, he made another trip down the mountain, this time to check for signs that their sanctuary had been discovered. What he found at Tom Mackenzie's ranch confirmed his worst fears. 3 men came through yesterday, Tom reported, his face grim, asking questions about a woman and child traveling alone. One of them matched the description you gave me of this Marcus character. Big, mean-looking, with scars on his knuckles like he'd been in too many fights. Ezra felt the familiar coldness settle in his chest, the same focused calm that had once made him one of the most effective federal marshals in the territory. "What did you tell them?" Nothing useful. Said I hadn't seen anyone matching that description, which was true enough. I haven't seen them, only heard about them from you." Tom's weathered face creased with concern. "But they weren't buying it entirely. Asked about tracks, about smoke from chimneys, about which trails might be passable this time of year. They say where they were headed next. North, toward the Garrett place. Figure they'll work their way through every homestead in the area, asking the same questions, until someone gives them what they want." Ezra nodded grimly. It was exactly what he would have done in Marcus's position. Systematic, thorough, relentless. The kind of hunt that eventually succeeded through sheer persistence. "How much time do you think we have?" Tom asked. "A week, maybe 2 if the weather stays bad and the high trails remain blocked." Ezra calculated distances and travel times in his head, factoring in snow conditions and the difficulty of moving through unfamiliar mountain terrain. "But I can't count on weather to save us. We need to be ready sooner than that." He spent the rest of the day with Tom, finalizing plans that had the grim efficiency of a military operation. 6 men had agreed to help, all veterans, all with their own reasons for disliking bullies who preyed on women and children. They would position themselves at key points along the likely approaches to Ezra's cabin, creating a network of early warning and, if necessary, crossfire. "You sure about this?" Tom asked, as they concluded their preparations. "Once shooting starts, there's no calling it back. These men will be marked, same as you." Ezra thought about Emma's nightmares, about Sarah's quiet courage in the face of months of fear, about the peace they'd all found in his small cabin during the long winter months. "I'm sure," he said. The trip back up the mountain took longer than usual. Ezra moved carefully, checking for signs of pursuit, setting small markers that would tell him if anyone else had passed this way. By the time he reached his cabin, full darkness had fallen, and his nerves were stretched taut with the hyper-awareness that came before violence. Sarah took one look at his face and knew immediately that their time of peace was ending. "How long?" she asked quietly, after Emma had been settled for the night with her wooden doll and a story about brave princesses who weren't afraid of dragons. "Not long enough." Ezra moved to the window. checking sight lines and fields of fire with the automatic competence of someone who'd done it many times before. A week at most, maybe less if they get lucky or find someone more talkative than Tom. Sarah nodded, accepting the reality with the same quiet strength that had gotten her through 6 months of running. "What do you need me to do?" The question surprised him. Most people in her situation would have asked what was going to happen to them, or begged him to run with them to some other sanctuary. But Sarah was asking how she could help fight. "Can you handle a rifle?" he asked. "James taught me to shoot rabbits and prairie dogs. I'm not expert, but I don't miss what I aim at." Ezra pulled his spare Winchester from the chest and handed it to her. She took it with familiar competence, checking the action and sighting down the barrel with movements that spoke of genuine experience rather than wishful thinking. "Emma?" he asked. Sarah's face tightened. "She's brave, but she's still a child. If shooting starts, there's a root cellar under the cabin floor behind the wood box. Hidden door, well ventilated, stocked with supplies. She could hide there and be safe no matter what happens above. You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" Sarah's voice held a note of wonder. "Even before you knew about Marcus, you were preparing for something like this." Ezra was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Maybe, or maybe I just never learned to stop being a marshal, even after I turned in the badge. Old habits, I suppose." They spent the evening teaching Emma a new game, hide and seek in the root cellar, making it fun and exciting rather than frightening. The child took to it with enthusiasm, delighted by the secret space beneath their feet, and proud that she'd been trusted with something so important. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, clutching her prayer book, a small Bible that had belonged to her father, Sarah and Ezra sat by the fire planning for possibilities neither wanted to discuss directly. "If something happens to me," Ezra said carefully, "Tom Mackenzie will see that you and Emma get safely to Denver or wherever you want to go. He's a good man, and he owes me enough favors to ensure your protection. Nothing's going to happen to you." Sarah's voice was fierce with determination. "We're going to face this together, and we're going to win, and then we're going to get back to the life we've been building here." Her use of "we" and "our life" wasn't lost on either of them. Somewhere during the long winter months, without either of them quite acknowledging it, they'd stopped being strangers offering temporary shelter and become something much more permanent and precious. "Sarah," Ezra began, then stopped, not sure how to voice feelings that seemed too large and too fragile for words. She saved him the trouble by moving closer on the rough wooden bench they shared, taking his scarred hands in her softer ones. "I know," she said simply. "I feel it too, but let's say it after, when we're safe. When we can plan for a future instead of just hoping to survive the next few days." Ezra nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words, even as part of him wanted to speak his heart while he still could. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently and turned back to their preparations, knowing that the best way to express his feelings was to ensure that the future she spoke of actually had a chance to exist. Outside, the wind picked up again, bringing with it the scent of snow and the promise that winter wasn't quite finished with the high country. But inside the cabin, 2 adults prepared for war while a child slept peacefully nearby, all of them sustained by the fragile hope that love might be strong enough to defeat the darkness that was coming to find them. They came on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air held the sharp bite of a late winter storm. Emma saw them first, her small voice cutting through the cabin's morning routine like a knife. "Mama, there are men coming." Sarah dropped the plate she'd been washing and moved to the window beside Ezra, who was already reaching for his rifle. Through the trees, 3 riders picked their way carefully up the narrow trail, their horses picking through patches of snow and exposed rock with the deliberate pace of men who knew they'd found what they were looking for. "The root cellar," Ezra said quietly to Sarah. "Get Emma down there now." But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The riders had emerged from the tree line into the clearing around his cabin, and the man in the lead, big, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had seen too many fights, was already dismounting with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages. "Marcus Patterson," Sarah whispered, and Ezra heard 15 years of fear compressed into those two words. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice boomed across the clearing, friendly and false as a snake's smile. "There you are, sister. Been looking all over creation for you and little Emma." Ezra positioned himself between the door and his unexpected family, rifle ready, but not yet raised. Through the window, he could see Marcus's two companions, hard men with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of hurting people for money. "What do you want, Marcus?" Sarah called through the door, her voice steadier than Ezra had expected. "Now, is that any way to greet family?" Marcus spread his hands in a gesture of wounded innocence. "I've come to take you home where you belong. You and the girl. James would have wanted his family looked after proper. James wanted us safe from you," Sarah replied. "That's why we left." Marcus's false friendliness cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath. "Safe? Look at you, Sarah, living in some hermit's cabin in the middle of nowhere, teaching that child to live like an animal. This is what you call safe?" Ezra had heard enough. He opened the door and stepped onto his porch, rifle held with casual competence that made all three riders reassess their situation immediately. Up close, Marcus was even bigger than he'd appeared from a distance, easily 6.5 feet tall, with hands that looked like they could break a man's neck without much effort. "Name's McLean," Ezra said conversationally. "This is my property and these are my guests. I'm thinking you gentlemen took a wrong turn somewhere." Marcus studied him with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. "You'd be the hermit then. Heard you were some kind of mountain man, living rough up here by yourself." His smile held no warmth at all. "I appreciate you looking after my family, but we'll be taking them home now. They're not going anywhere they don't want to go." The simple statement hung in the cold air between them, loaded with implications that made Marcus's companions shift nervously in their saddles. But Marcus himself seemed more amused than concerned. "That's real noble of you, friend, but this is family business. Sarah's got responsibilities back in Kansas, debts that need settling, arrangements that need honoring." "What kind of arrangements?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that pay off gambling debts and keep everyone healthy and happy." Marcus's mask slipped further, revealing the brutality beneath his false civility. "See, Sarah's husband left quite a mess behind when he died. Owed money to people who don't like to wait for payment. Lucky for her, I know a man willing to take her off my hands, settle those debts in exchange for a young wife and ready-made daughter." The casual way Marcus discussed selling Sarah and Emma like livestock made Ezra's vision narrow with the kind of controlled fury he hadn't felt since his marshalling days. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped onto the porch beside him, her face pale, but her voice steady. "I won't go with you, Marcus. Not me, not Emma. Find another way to pay your debts." Marcus's laugh was ugly. "Oh, sister, you don't have a choice in this. See, legally speaking, you and the girl are my responsibility now that James is gone. Family court in Kansas sees it that way, and I got papers to prove it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, waving it like a weapon. "Legal guardianship signed and sealed, which means what I say goes, and I say you're coming home to meet your new husband." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, and Ezra saw her sway slightly as the implications sank in. Legal guardianship would give Marcus almost unlimited power over her and Emma, the kind of authority that could be enforced by law rather than just violence. That's assuming the courts would honor documents obtained through fraud and intimidation, a new voice said from behind them. All 5 adults turned to see Emma standing in the cabin doorway. But it wasn't Emma's voice that had spoken. Behind her, stepping into view with the careful movements of someone trying not to appear threatening, was Tom Mackenzie. But Tom wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall, thin man in a black coat and official-looking badge. Someone Ezra didn't recognize, but whose presence changed everything about the situation developing in his clearing. Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hayes, the stranger said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made even hardened criminals reconsider their options. And you would be Marcus Patterson, wanted for questioning in the deaths of 2 men in Dodge City and the suspected kidnapping of Sarah Patterson and her daughter. The change in Marcus was instantaneous. The false friendliness disappeared entirely, replaced by the cornered fury of a man who'd just realized his carefully laid plans were falling apart. You got no authority here, he snarled. This is family business, and I got legal papers. You have forged documents obtained through bribery and perjury, Hayes interrupted calmly. He pulled out his own papers, official-looking documents with federal seals. These are federal warrants for your arrest, issued after investigation into your activities in 3 territories. Sarah's hand found Ezra's arm, her grip tight with hope and disbelief. How? She whispered. Hayes smiled slightly. Your friend Mr. Mackenzie sent word to some old contacts when he learned of your situation. Seems like Mr. McLean here had quite a reputation in federal law enforcement circles before he retired. Marcus's eyes snapped to Ezra with sudden understanding and fury. McLean, Ezra McLean. You're supposed to be dead, you son of a bitch. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Ezra replied calmly. Though inside, he felt the familiar excitement that came with pieces of a long puzzle finally clicking into place. Hayes continued his explanation, his voice never losing its professional calm. Federal marshals don't really retire, Mr. Patterson. They just go inactive. When we learned that one of our former colleagues was harboring victims of your criminal enterprise, well, let's say it became a matter of professional interest. The wanted poster Hayes, produced from his coat, bore Marcus's likeness, and a list of charges that made even his 2 companions begin backing their horses away from their employer. Murder, kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy, the kind of federal crimes that ended with a rope or a lifetime in territorial prison. The inheritance, Sarah said suddenly, understanding flooding her voice. This was never about guardianship or family responsibility. James left something, didn't he? Something valuable enough to kill for. Marcus's expression confirmed her guess before he could speak. Your husband struck silver before he died, Sarah, a claim worth more money than you can imagine. But the mine's in Emma's name, held in trust until she comes of age. Unless, of course, her legal guardian decides to sell it for her benefit. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't been hunting them out of twisted family loyalty or even simple greed. He'd been after an inheritance that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams, an inheritance that required Emma's cooperation or legal guardianship to claim, which makes you doubly stupid, Hayes observed with the casual cruelty of a lawman who'd seen too many criminals destroy themselves through their own arrogance. Not only did you commit federal crimes to obtain forged guardianship papers, but you did it for a mine claim that was never valid in the first place. James Patterson filed his claim incorrectly. Wrong territory, wrong filing office, wrong dates. The land you've been killing for belongs to the federal government, and always has. The look on Marcus's face as this final revelation sank in was almost worth the months of fear and running Sarah and Emma had endured. Almost, but not quite, because even cornered and exposed, Marcus Patterson was still a dangerous man with nothing left to lose. And Ezra could see the exact moment when he decided that if he couldn't have what he'd come for, he'd make sure no one else could either. The moment stretched like a taut wire between Marcus's growing desperation and the federal marshal's quiet authority. Ezra felt the familiar pre-combat tension settle in his muscles, the heightened awareness that came when violence hung in the air like morning mist. Easy now, Hayes said, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon as he read the same dangerous signs in Marcus's posture. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of legal options. Best thing you can do is surrender peaceful-like and let the courts sort this out. Marcus's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Courts? You think I'm going to let some federal judge put a rope around my neck for chasing after what should have been mine by right? It was never yours, Sarah said, stepping forward despite Ezra's restraining hand. James never owed you anything, and neither do Emma and I. You created those debts, Marcus. You gambled away your own money and then decided our lives were collateral you could spend. Your husband was weak, Marcus snarled, his facade of reasonableness finally cracking completely. Too weak to take what he could have had. Too weak to understand that family looks after family no matter what it costs. James was a good man, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears that had started in her eyes. He worked honest, treated people with respect, and loved his family without trying to own them. You never understood any of that. Emma had remained silent through this exchange, but now she stepped closer to her mother, her small hand finding Sarah's and holding tight. In her other hand, she clutched the inheritance papers Hayes had shown them, legal documents that proved she was the legitimate heir to a mine that didn't exist, making her both worthless and priceless in the span of a single conversation. "None of this changes anything," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet tone that had preceded violence in too many confrontations Ezra had witnessed. "Dead witnesses don't testify in federal court. The threat was clear enough to make Hayes's hand complete its journey to his weapon, but Marcus was already moving. Instead of drawing on the marshal, he spurred his horse toward the cabin porch, clearly intending to grab Emma before anyone could stop him. What he hadn't counted on was Ezra's reflexes, honed by years of war and law enforcement into something faster than conscious thought. The rifle came up smoothly, and Ezra's shot took Marcus's horse in the shoulder, sending both animal and rider tumbling in a confusion of screaming horse and cursing man. Marcus rolled clear of his fallen mount and came up with a pistol in his hand, but he was shaken and off balance, giving Hayes the opening he needed to draw his own weapon. "Drop it, Patterson," the marshal commanded. "Last warning!" For a moment it seemed like Marcus might actually surrender. His eyes moved between Hayes's drawn pistol and Ezra's rifle, calculating odds that weren't in his favor. But then his gaze fell on Emma, and something ugly and desperate flashed across his face. "Maybe I can't have the mine," he said, his voice carrying the particular madness of a man who'd lost everything and decided to take as much of the world down with him as possible. "But I can make damn sure nobody else does either." He swung his pistol toward Emma, and time seemed to slow to a crawl for everyone in the clearing. Sarah screamed her daughter's name and threw herself toward the child. Hayes was bringing his own weapon around, but from his angle he didn't have a clear shot. Tom Mackenzie was reaching for his rifle, but knew he was too far away to matter. Only Ezra had the angle and the time, and for an eternal instant he saw the choice laid out before him with crystalline clarity. He could kill Marcus Patterson, put a bullet through the man's heart, and end this threat forever. It would be justified, legal, necessary, but it would also mean that Emma's last memory of their sanctuary would be of Ezra taking a human life, of violence and death in the place that had meant safety and peace. In that frozen moment, Ezra made a different choice. Instead of aiming for Marcus's chest, he shifted slightly and fired for the man's gun hand. The bullet took Marcus in the wrist, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the snow. Marcus screamed and fell to his knees, clutching his shattered wrist to his chest. Hayes was on him before he could recover, federal handcuffs clicking into place with the finality of judgment delivered. Marcus's two companions, seeing their employer down and surrounded, raised their hands in surrender rather than face the combined firepower of a federal marshal, an ex-marshal, and whatever backup they assumed was waiting in the trees. "Emma!" Sarah had reached her daughter and was checking frantically for injuries, her hands shaking as she ran them over the child's arms and face. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay, Mama," Emma said, though her voice was small and frightened. "Ezra saved us, just like I knew he would." The simple faith in her voice nearly broke Ezra's composure. He lowered his rifle with hands that weren't quite steady and moved to where Sarah knelt with Emma in her arms. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's finally over." Hayes was securing the prisoners with the efficient competence of someone who'd done it many times before. Marcus had lapsed into sullen silence, his wounded wrist crudely bandaged with strips torn from his own shirt. His companions, revealed to be small-time criminals who'd worked for Marcus more out of fear than loyalty, were eager to cooperate in exchange for lenient treatment. "We'll need statements from all of you," Hayes told Ezra and Sarah as Tom helped load the prisoners onto their horses. "But that can wait until we get these men to a proper jail. Federal court will want to hear this story from the beginning. What happens now?" Sarah asked, Emma still pressed against her side like she might disappear if her mother let her go. "Now you're free," Hayes replied simply. "Free to go where you want, live how you want, raise your daughter without looking over your shoulder. Marcus Patterson's going to prison for a very long time, and his associates will be too scared of federal attention to cause you any more trouble." Sarah looked up at Ezra, and he saw a future in her eyes. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to a temporary sanctuary, but the quiet confidence of a woman who'd found where she belonged. "And the mine?" Emma asked, apparently unconcerned with the larger implications of freedom and more interested in the immediate question of inheritance. Hayes smiled at her seriousness. "There is no mine, little miss. Your father thought he'd found silver, but the assay was wrong and the claim was filed incorrectly. I'm sorry to disappoint you." Emma considered this information with the philosophical acceptance of childhood. "That's all right," she said finally. "I've got better things than silver anyway." She looked around at Ezra's cabin, at the carved animals scattered near the fire, at the workspace where she'd been learning to shape wood into something beautiful, at the people who'd become her family through choice rather than blood. "I've got home," she said simply. Later, after Hayes had taken his prisoners down the mountain, and Tom had returned to his ranch with promises to check on them regularly, the three members of Ezra's unlikely family found themselves alone again in the cabin that had sheltered them through the winter. But something had changed in the few hours since Marcus's arrival. The immediate threat was over, yes, but more than that, the pretense that this was temporary, that Sarah and Emma were just guests waiting for spring, had finally been abandoned. "So," Sarah said as they sat around the fire that evening, Emma asleep against her shoulder with her wooden doll in her arms, "what do we do now?" Ezra looked at them both, the woman who'd taught him to hope again, and the child who'd reminded him what it meant to care for someone more than yourself, and felt a peace settle in his chest that he'd thought was lost. "Forever now," he said, reaching for Sarah's free hand and holding it gently in his own. "We build the life we want, together." Sarah's smile was brighter than the fire, warmer than the spring that was finally coming to the mountains. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Outside, the wind had died to nothing, and the first clear stars in weeks were beginning to show through breaks in the clouds. Winter was ending at last, but inside the cabin, three people who'd found each other in the storm were just beginning to discover what it meant to have a real home. The federal courthouse in Denver was nothing like the rough frontier justice Ezra remembered from his marshalling days. Electric lights cast steady illumination over polished wood and brass fittings, while properly dressed clerks moved between courtrooms with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Even the judge wore robes that looked like they'd never seen trail dust or tobacco stains. Ezra sat in the witness chair, his hand resting on a leather-bound Bible, as he swore to tell the truth about events that already felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Across the courtroom, Marcus Patterson sat shackled between two federal deputies, his wounded wrist still bandaged, but his eyes burning with the particular hatred of a man who'd lost everything and blamed everyone but himself. "State your name and occupation for the record," the prosecutor requested. "Ezra McLean, former federal marshal, currently a private citizen residing in the Colorado mountains. And how did you come to know the defendants in this case?" Ezra's eyes found Sarah in the gallery, Emma sitting beside her with the solemn attention of a child who understood that important adult business was taking place. Both of them had testified earlier, Sarah with quiet dignity and Emma with the clear honesty that made even hardened federal attorneys smile despite themselves. "They came to my door, seeking shelter from a winter storm," Ezra said simply. 3 people running from something they couldn't fight alone. The prosecutor led him through the events methodically. The long winter months, Marcus's pursuit, the confrontation at his cabin, the federal intervention that had finally ended Sarah and Emma's ordeal. Ezra answered each question with the precise honesty of someone who'd testified in federal court before, sticking to facts and letting the jury draw their own conclusions about motivations and character. When Marcus's attorney cross-examined him, trying to paint the whole affair as a misunderstanding between family members, Ezra's responses were calm but uncompromising. "Mr. McLean, isn't it true that you interfered with a man's legal right to care for his deceased brother's family?" "No, sir. I protected 2 people from a man who was trying to sell them to pay his gambling debts. But surely you understand that family relationships can be complicated, that outsiders might misinterpret. I understand that when a grown man threatens to hurt a child to control her mother, there's no misinterpreting involved." The attorney tried several more approaches, but Ezra had testified against skilled criminals before, and he knew how to answer questions without giving ground on essential truths. When he finally stepped down from the witness chair, he caught Marcus's eye for the first time since the trial began. What he saw there was ugly, but no longer frightening. The impotent rage of a bully who'd finally been held accountable for his actions. Marcus Patterson was finished, and they both knew it. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. Federal crimes had been committed in pursuit of a fraudulent inheritance claim. Documents had been forged. Witnesses had been intimidated. Lives had been threatened. The evidence was overwhelming, the motives clear, the guilt undeniable. Marcus's attorney made a game attempt at mitigation, talking about the pressures of frontier life and the desperation that drove good men to bad choices. But even he seemed to recognize that his client had crossed too many lines to claim sympathy from anyone. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of interstate flight to avoid prosecution? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of document fraud in federal court? Guilty, Your Honor. The verdicts continued through a litany of federal crimes that would keep Marcus Patterson in territorial prison until he was too old to threaten anyone ever again. His accomplices, who had cooperated fully with federal prosecutors, received lighter sentences, but would still spend years behind bars thinking about the wisdom of taking jobs from desperate men. When the judge asked Marcus if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood with the help of his guards and turned to face Sarah and Emma directly. "You think you've won something," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's formal silence. "But you're still the same worthless woman who couldn't keep a husband alive and can't raise a child proper. That hermit of yours might have saved you this time, but men like him don't stay. When he leaves, you'll have nothing again." The bailiff moved to silence him, but Sarah stood before anyone could intervene. "You're wrong, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had gotten her through months of running and hiding. "I already have everything that matters. I have my daughter, I have people who care about us, and I have the knowledge that Emma will grow up free from your poison." She sat down without waiting for his response, and Ezra felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly took his breath away. This was the woman who'd knocked on his door seeking shelter, not the frightened victim Marcus had described, but someone who'd found her own strength and learned to use it when the judge pronounced sentence, 25 years in. Federal prison without possibility of parole. Marcus Patterson finally understood that his long campaign of terror was over. The federal marshals led him away in chains, and Ezra knew he would never see the man again outside the courthouse, in the Colorado sunshine that seemed impossibly bright after the formal darkness of federal justice. Sarah and Emma waited for him on the steps. Emma ran to him immediately, wrapping her small arms around his waist with the fierce affection of a child who'd never doubted that the adults in her life would protect her. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked, though her face suggested she already knew the answer. Ezra pulled out a tarnished star from his coat pocket. The federal marshal's badge that Deputy Hayes had returned to him with an offer to rejoin the service if he ever changed his mind about retirement. "It's really over," he said, and dropped the badge into a trash barrel beside the courthouse steps. He had better things to do with his life than hunt criminals. He had a family to go home to. The hotel room in Denver felt strange after months of cabin life. Too many walls, too much noise from the street below, too much distance from the mountains that had become home. Emma stood at the window, watching carriages and people move past, with the fascination of someone who'd spent the winter seeing only snow and trees. "Will we really go back to the cabin?" she asked, turning from the window with an expression that mixed hope with the caution of a child who'd learned not to take good things for granted. Sarah looked up from the papers spread across the hotel's small table, legal documents that formally ended her connection to Kansas. "And Marcus Patterson forever. If Ezra will have us," she said carefully. "This is his decision too, sweetheart." But Ezra had already made his decision, had been making it gradually through all the months of winter and all the days of testimony and legal proceedings. The question wasn't whether he wanted them to stay. The question was whether he had the courage to ask them to build something permanent together. "There's something I need to say," he began, then stopped as both Sarah and Emma turned to look at him with identical expressions of patient attention. "Something I've been thinking about since the trial ended." He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket, the drawing Emma had made of their cabin weeks ago, carefully preserved despite everything they'd been through. In her childish hand, she'd labeled it "Home," with letters that wandered across the page like a happy trail. "This is what I want," he said simply, holding up the drawing. "Not just the cabin, not just the mountains, but this. The three of us together, making something that lasts." Sarah's breath caught, and he saw tears start in her eyes, but they were the good kind of tears, the kind that came with relief and joy and the end of long uncertainty. "Emma," he continued, dropping to one knee so he could look the child directly in the eye, "I know I'm not your real father, and I can't replace the man you lost. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be the father who helps you grow up. I'd like to teach you everything I know about the mountains and carving and being strong enough to protect the people you love." Emma didn't answer with words. Instead, she threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. And Ezra felt something in his chest that had been broken for 15 years, finally healed completely. "And Sarah," he said, standing but keeping one arm around Emma, "I know this isn't the life you planned for yourself. Teaching school in some frontier settlement, raising Emma among civilized people with proper opportunities. But if you're willing to take a chance on a mountain man who's forgotten how to live anywhere but the wilderness—" "Yes," Sarah interrupted, laughing through her tears. "Yes to all of it. Yes to the mountains, yes to the cabin, yes to building a life together. But mostly yes to you, Ezra McLean, because you gave us more than shelter from a storm. You gave us a place to belong." She moved closer, and this time when Ezra took her hands in his, there was no hesitation, no careful distance maintained out of propriety or fear. There was only the simple truth that they had found each other against all odds and decided to hold on. "Will you marry me?" he asked, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Both of you, I mean. Will you let me adopt Emma legally and marry you properly and make this official in every way that matters? Can I keep my wooden doll?" Emma asked seriously, apparently considering this the most important aspect of the whole arrangement. "You can keep whatever you want, sweetheart," Ezra assured her. "Everything that matters to you matters to me." "Then yes," Emma declared with the decisive authority of childhood. "But I want to be Emma McLean, not Emma Patterson. I don't want his name anymore." Sarah's tears came faster now, and she pulled both Ezra and Emma into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey through dangerous country. "We'll need a preacher," she said practically, even as she held them both tight. "And witnesses. And I suppose Emma should have a proper dress for the occasion. Tom Mackenzie can stand up with me," Ezra said. "And his wife Martha would be delighted to help with wedding plans. She's been telling everyone in 3 counties that I needed a wife and family to make an honest man of me. Were you not honest before? Emma asked, with the literal mindedness that made adult conversations so interesting. I was honest, Ezra replied solemnly. But I wasn't complete. There's a difference. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, not just for a wedding, but for the life they would build together in the mountains. Sarah would continue Emma's education and maybe teach other children if any families settled in the area. Emma would learn mountain skills alongside her letters and numbers. Ezra would expand the cabin, add rooms for a growing family, maybe even build a proper school if more settlers came. But underneath all the practical planning lay something much more fundamental, the recognition that they had created something rare and precious. From the raw materials of loneliness, desperation, and simple human kindness, as they prepared for bed in the hotel's unfamiliar rooms, Emma came to Ezra with her wooden doll clutched in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. I made this for you, she said shyly, offering him the paper. It was another drawing, this one showing 4 figures standing in front of a cabin, a man, a woman, a girl, and a smaller figure that might have been a baby. Above them, she had written in her careful child's handwriting, "Our family, 4 people." Ezra asked gently. Emma nodded seriously. "Mama and I talked about it. We think our family might get bigger someday. If that's all right with you?" Ezra looked across the room at Sarah, who was watching this exchange with a soft smile and eyes that held promises for a future neither of them had dared imagine just a year ago. "I think that would be wonderful," he said, tucking the drawing carefully into his shirt pocket next to his heart. "I think that would be the most wonderful thing in the world." That night, as he lay in the hotel's strange bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, Ezra pulled out the thin gold band he'd worn for 15 years, Margaret's ring, symbol of a love that had shaped him but need no longer define him. He held it for a long moment, remembering not just the loss and grief it represented, but also the joy and hope that had come before the sorrow. Margaret would have liked Sarah, he realized, would have approved of his choice to love again, to build something new from the ashes of what he'd lost. In the morning, he would visit a jeweler and commission 2 new rings, gold bands that would symbolize not replacement but continuation, not forgetting but growing beyond the past into something larger and more complete. But tonight, he simply held the old ring and whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who'd taught him what love could be, before he'd learned what love could become. 6 months later, Ezra woke to the sound of laughter drifting through the cabin windows, Sarah's voice mixed with Emma's. Both of them apparently engaged in some domestic project that required a great deal of discussion and occasional bursts of delighted giggling. He lay still for a moment, savoring the luxury of waking slowly instead of snapping to alertness at the first sound of movement. The cabin felt different now, expanded not just by the additional rooms he'd built, but by the presence of people who filled empty spaces with warmth and purpose. Through the bedroom window, he could see the valley below, beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Aspens starting their transformation from summer green to the gold that would soon paint the mountainsides in brilliant beauty. It was his favorite time of year, the season when the mountains showed their most spectacular face before settling into winter's quiet rest. "Papa Ezra," Emma's voice called from the kitchen. "Mama says breakfast is ready and we have something to show you." The title still made his heart skip a beat, even after months of hearing it. Emma had started calling him Papa Ezra the day after their wedding, as if the legal ceremony had simply made official what she'd already decided in her heart. Sarah was Mrs. McLean now, and Emma was legally Emma McLean, and the 3 of them had settled into family life with the easy rhythm of people who belonged together. He found them in the kitchen, both wearing aprons dusted with flour and expressions of barely contained excitement. On the table sat a cake, somewhat lopsided, but obviously made with great care and attention to detail. "It's not my birthday," Ezra said, genuinely puzzled. "It's not a birthday cake," Emma announced proudly. It's a celebration cake. Tell him, Mama. Sarah moved closer, and Ezra noticed the particular glow in her face that he'd been hoping to see for weeks now. Her hand moved to rest on her stomach in the universal gesture of women carrying new life. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply, her voice full of quiet joy and wonder. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees suddenly weak. He sank into the nearest chair, staring at his wife with an expression that made Emma giggle. "You look funny, Papa Ezra. Are you happy or scared?" "Both," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Definitely both." Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "I know this is sooner than we planned, and I know it brings up memories of—" "No," Ezra interrupted gently. "Those aren't bad memories anymore, Sarah. They're just part of the story that led me to you. To this." He pulled her closer, his hand joining hers on the slight curve of her belly where their child was growing. The gesture felt both familiar and miraculous, connecting him to dreams he'd thought were buried forever, while opening doorways to possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. "When?" he asked. "Spring," Sarah replied. "Around the time the mountain flowers start blooming." Emma bounced excitedly beside them. "I'm going to teach the baby to carve, and to read, and to catch snowflakes on their tongue." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Ezra found himself laughing despite the tears that had started in his eyes. This was what happiness felt like, not the desperate gratitude of a man who'd been given an unexpected reprieve, but the deep contentment of someone who'd found his place in the world and settled into it completely. They spent the morning celebrating with Emma's lopsided cake and making plans for the changes a baby would bring to their mountain home. Sarah would need to take things easier as her pregnancy progressed, which meant Ezra would handle more of the heavy work around the cabin. Emma appointed herself official baby tender in training and began making elaborate preparations for her future role as big sister. In the afternoon, while Sarah napped and Emma worked on a wooden cradle she'd designed herself, Ezra climbed to his favorite spot on the ridge above the cabin. The view from there encompassed the entire valley, showing him the small kingdom they'd carved out of wilderness and solitude. He pulled out his journal, the same leather-bound book where he'd recorded his thoughts through the long winter when Sarah and Emma had first arrived. The early entries seemed like they'd been written by a different man, someone who'd forgotten how to hope for more than simple survival. September 21st, 1887. "Sarah told me today that we're expecting a child. I thought I'd feel fear, remembering what happened before, but instead I feel something I can only describe as grateful anticipation. This baby will be born into love and security, surrounded by family who want nothing more than to protect and nurture new life." Looking back at these pages, I can see the journey from who I was to who I've become. The man who opened his door to strangers in a winter storm was broken, bitter, afraid to care about anything because caring hurt too much. The man writing these words has remembered something I'd forgotten, that the risk of loss is always worth taking for the possibility of love. Emma asked me yesterday if I missed being alone. The question surprised me because I realized I can barely remember what that felt like anymore. Not the practical aspects, those I remember clearly enough, but the emotional reality of existing without connection to other hearts. I told her that some kinds of loneliness are so deep you don't realize you're drowning until someone throws you a rope. She didn't understand the metaphor, but Sarah did. She always does. He closed the journal and looked down at his cabin, where smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney as Sarah prepared supper, and Emma's voice could be heard singing one of the songs she'd learned from her mother. Soon he would go down and join them for the evening meal, and they would sit by the fire while Sarah mended clothes and Emma worked on her carving, and he read aloud from one of the books that had once been his only companions. Later, after Emma was asleep, he and Sarah would sit together in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to share both words and quiet. They would make plans for the baby's arrival, discuss improvements to the cabin, laugh about Emma's elaborate schemes for entertaining her future sibling, but most of all, They would simply be together in the home they'd built from kindness, courage, and the willingness to believe that broken people could still create something whole. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any cathedral window, Ezra stood and started back down the mountain toward the warm glow of his cabin's windows. He was no longer a man who lived alone in the wilderness, guarding his solitude like a jealous treasure. He was a husband, a father, a protector of the family he'd found in the most unlikely circumstances. He was, finally and completely, home.